Dubbo Regional Council held their June meeting last night, and I believe there are a number of issues on the agenda. I'm just going to pick off a few. I was wondering what happened with the aquatic centres and the discussion about whether or not council was going to retain management. Can you tell me about that first of all, please?
Yeah, certainly. So there was interesting information in the agenda for the business papers last night around the aquatic leisure centres. As many people would know, once upon a time, Dubbo's Aquatic Leisure Centre used to be contracted to an external organisation, and so they ran the pool as such in conjunction with council doing some of the long-term maintenance. A few years ago, that was taken to an internal process where it was just all managed by council staff. And looking through the figures, the current group of councillors said, well, there didn't seem to be a business case for bringing that internal. Not sure why it was brought internal, but now that we've had a chance to run it for a couple of years internal, it seems to be more expensive to run it internally than running it external. So rather than just make a decision without all the data, can we please have the information about the 3 swimming pools we've got, Wellington, Geary and Dubbo, and information about what the options might be to run that internal or external. So that information was presented last night, and it was a good report in terms of the fairly detailed information, a lot in that. So rather than make a decision based just on that, the resolution from council last night was to, note the information, thank the staff for the information, but have a workshop, so dedicate a workshop just to go through that process and then formally resolve which way we'll go. I just don't think the decision by councillors last night was really about the fact that a council meeting is a good place to resolve final decisions, but it's not a great place to have open and forthright and thorough debate about a topic. So having a workshop to really thrash all that out, and I suspect that workshop will go for a couple of hours alone. And again, a council meeting, you just don't have the time to go through things in that depth. So that'll happen. I suspect that will happen in the next month, and then we'll bring that back to a future council meeting to formally resolve which way we'll go there.
Okay, and I dare say, the issue is cost, fundamentally, isn't it? And whether or not council can make savings here and whether or not it's actually in the best interest of the community to have it in council's hands.
That's right. And if we go back a couple of years ago, the cost to run all 3 pools was in the vicinity of $800,000. That's a lot of money for the community to contribute to those 3 facilities. Now that we've got it internal, the cost blew out a year ago to about $1.7 million. So at face value, you'd say that it was much more cost effective having it contracted out. But there are things that change, and there's COVID in the middle there, and so there are a range of variables. So again, rather than just make a decision because we looked at one line item in the budget and said, oh, look at that, it's a bigger number, let's change that. That's where we said, let's get a proper analysis of it, and then let's really dig down deep in a workshop and then come out with the final decision. And you're right, we want to provide a good service to the community, but we also don't want to spend more money than we need to.
Yes, makes sense. Now, moving on, what's happening with the former Carpet Court building? I believe you've decided to lease that out privately. Is that the case?
So there's an organisation, a not-for-profit organisation, that's involved in the RES, it's involved in so when I say the RES, the Renewable Energy Zone, in some of the new industries that we'll see. And that's the exciting thing for Dubbo Regional Council. We are right in the middle of all these potential new industries. As people know, they drive down towards Wellington and Mudgee. We can see wind turbines there. We can see solar farms. There's a battery that's going to go in there, a large-scale battery in there. And we'll see a lot more of that happening. So what other industries are around? And there's one organisation, as I said, a not-for-profit, that actually does this process where they reuse solar panels. And Dubbo is a perfect place for that because you might remember several years ago we became the #1 rooftop solar connector per capita in the entire nation. So we've got lots of people that have got solar panels, and those solar panels are getting better all the time. So sometimes people are actually replacing their existing solar panels with new solar panels that are even more efficient. So this organisation is a startup trying to get to that stage where they're reusing those solar panels. Don't throw them out. Don't try and recycle them. Let's reuse them. So we did what council agreed to last night was, as a startup in that renewable energy zone, we're going to give them a 6-month lease at the Carpet Court for a cheap rent, cheaper than market rent. So $100 per week we'll charge them for that rent to help that industry get up and started. And then after 6 months, then we hope that they'll grow to the stage where they'll be too big for Carpet Court, but it's not the idea to keep them in there necessarily. And maybe they will stay there, but whatever we do after 6 months will either be at commercial lease rates or they'll go and find somewhere much bigger to continue that operation. So good chance for economic development in Dubbo and a good chance to start a whole new industry.
Great. Yep, that does sound good, actually. Now, regional housing roadmap. Can you tell me what was discussed, or was that discussed? I believe it was on the agenda.
It was on the agenda, that's right. And that roadmap is really just about saying we need some way of looking at what's happening in housing. So one of the things that everyone knows, anyone you talk to says there's not enough housing, it's hard to get a rental, house prices are going up because demand is so high. And let me just mention also to people in Dubbo that this is not a Dubbo Regional Council problem specifically. I've just returned from Canberra this week where we've had councils from across the nation, and whenever I'd sit down beside someone, meet someone at one of the forums or the dinners, I'd say, what are your issues in your council area? And every single one of them had housing as one of their top 3 issues in terms of lack of housing affordability. One of the things is that we can say, oh, this is terrible, everyone else has got the problem. Well, we'll just move on, I guess. But one thing that this council is keen to do is have some strategic direction, and there hasn't been a lot of strategic direction over the last few years. So this really is about just making sure we've got strategic direction, we've got a roadmap, we've got ways to address this. We're not going to solve the problem today, but if we keep saying, well, we can't solve the problem in the short term, we'll never solve the problem. So the roadmap is really about where are we going, what are the different ways that we can address this housing shortage, and also keep reporting back to council every 6 months so that councillors get a specific indicator of what's happening with housing in the Dubbo Regional Council area. So that certainly was discussed last night, and that was resolved to basically continue down that path.
So, I mean, what is the strategic direction? Do you have any idea where we're headed, what the plan is then to try and, attract more housing into the region, try and supply more housing for the people coming in?
It's a multi-pronged attack, and that's really part of the issue there. We've got certainly developers at the moment that are developing their land, the parcels of land they have, and developing that. We also, as another part of council last night, agreed to accelerate some of our land development, because in the past we've dabbled in land development with council, but we don't want to overtake the market because there are many other developers that we feel we should be supporting them rather than trying to compete head on all the time. But at the moment there is that housing crisis, so we voted last night to accelerate that housing development from our perspective as well. So that's part of it. And then looking at different ways. So for example, there are blocks of land at the moment in Dubbo that might be suitable for what people would call a granny flat, so having a smaller housing development on a block of land. So some people might have a 1,600 square metre block of land in town, for example, and there's every reason that they could put another dwelling on there, and there's certain conditions and rules around that, but just informing people about that, letting people know that those options are available, and that can solve some of that housing shortage, because it's just about more beds, more houses that we need in the community. So looking at different ways to do that, looking at dual occupancy, looking at even some medium density housing. So it would be fair to say there isn't just a silver bullet or a magic bullet that we can say there's a solution, but the solution is multiple variations of housing and how we can go forward with that.
Great, thank you. Now, moving on to the Nrl Contract Renewal. We're going to see more NRL games in Dubbo in the future?
Yeah, maybe not. That was a really interesting discussion, and there were 2 parts to that. One part was in the open council meeting where we just reported on the event. So the event was successful. 11,124 people attended the event. The feedback was fantastic. We had people from outside the region came to it, so there was lots of good information in the report. The only disappointing part of the report was the number, as in the final number that it cost the community. And we would have loved to have broken even on the event. That all comes down to ticket sales and a whole range of other sponsorships and expenses. But in the end, the number that we can report to the community is that the net cost to the community was $67,000. Now, the main part of the cost of hosting an NRL event is the payment to the NRL club. So they take a $350,000 payment. So we paid them $200,000. The state government has a program to add $150,000 to that. So they get paid their $350,000. And then we obviously go out there and sell tickets, sell sponsorship, etc. And so the money that we got in from that, again, the net loss was $67,000. So that's step one. And at $67,000, I think it would be fair to say that most councillors would say that's a reasonable cost to put on an event like that does inject $2.8 million into the economy. So that's a reasonable amount. We'd like to get it smaller, but that's okay. But the issue here is we're not guaranteed the $150,000 from the state government each year. We've already talked to the local member. There's an election next year, obviously, in March next year. So there's no guarantees from the state government about that. So if we hosted it again, the possibility might be that it might cost the community $217,000 based on the numbers from this year. And that's a bigger pill to swallow for councillors to say, we're going to take that money from the income we generate from rates from the community and essentially put on one NRL game. And that's where councillors said, well, gee, I don't know that we should just blaze ahead and go and do that because that's a large expense to the community. So what we resolved to do is have some more negotiations with some NRL clubs, see how we might reduce that and basically then bring that back to council once we go through some of those negotiations and see what else we might be able to do. So yes, there's the intent to go ahead. The councillors like the idea of going ahead, but don't like the idea of it costing the community $217,000. We are the first council that's actually been out there and actually talked to the community about that cost for an NRL game. People get excited about NRL games, but they don't realise that it costs money. And so I'm very keen, and councils are very keen, to make sure the community knows exactly how much it costs us and then give us feedback as to whether or not they want the NRL game or not.
That's very helpful, and I think you're right. I don't think many people would realise that that game actually cost us. I think it's so positively conveyed that we earned so much for the economy and that it was a boost for the economy. I don't think that's really communicated at all. So that's very helpful, actually, to know. Yeah, so thank you for that.
I think it's fair and transparent as well. And I know in years gone by when I've had negotiations with the NRL, I've always said that we'll get a good crowd, and sometimes in Sydney you might get crowds of 5,000 or 6,000 to a game. So bring the game regionally and we'll get a good crowd. And they've said, yes, we're keen to do that, but then they put their hand out. And I actually find it a little bit disingenuous of the NRL when they say, we want to take games to the country. We really believe in the country. And we say, great, let's bring games to the country. And they say, now, just hand over $350,000 and we'll go and support the bush. And I just find that is a little bit different to the messaging they put out there. I would prefer they came out to the bush, and we don't want the ticket sales. If they just came out and didn't charge us anything, you take the ticket sales. We're happy for you to do that. The reason we do take the ticket sales is because we've got to pay the $350,000 to them to come out.
Yeah, I don't know if many people would know that. Anyway, thank you. Now, moving on to renaming of Victoria Park, Tony Kelly, did that come up?
That absolutely came up, and we had some presentations by some members in public forum at the beginning of the meeting. In fact, there was one person very much in favour of the renaming of the Tony Kelly Reserve, or the reserve that's there to Tony Kelly Reserve, and there was one person who spoke against that. The little bit of history there is that this had been put forward previously as the renaming of Victoria Park No. 1 Oval, not the reserve, and that went through to the State Geographical Names Board. They went through a public consultation process. When they finished that public consultation process, they saw that the majority of submissions they received, and they got about 60 submissions, the majority of those submissions were against the renaming of No. 1 Oval to Tony Kelly Oval, and so they rejected the proposal. They've then come back to us and said there is another way you could do it. You could call Tony Kelly Reserve, the overall reserve there, not the No. 1 Oval. And so we could do that. But again, councillors thought that that seemed like almost a sneaky way to rename something the community had spoken against. The other option is that buildings can have names associated with them. For example, we've got the Bruce Needs Grandstand up at the Apex Oval. So you can have a building. There is a pavilion down there at No. 1 Oval, and so councillors thought that that might be an appropriate place to have Tony Kelly's name in recognition of the work that he did contribute to the Dubbo community. So after some discussion around the different options there last night, the vote from council was to rename the pavilion at No. 1 Oval the Tony Kelly Pavilion, but before going ahead with that, putting that out on public consultation, leaving that out there for 28 days, get submissions back from the public, and then go forward. Again, people were against the renaming of No. 1 Oval, and we were keen to see whether or not that same sentiment was around a pavilion there, in other words, the recognition of Tony with a different part, or whether it was against just the fact that Victoria Park No. 1 Oval had so much history that people didn't want No. 1 to be changed, the name there. So we'll go out now. We've resolved to get some public consultation on that in the specific area of renaming the pavilion the Tony Kelly Pavilion.
Great, thank you. Now, I know there are lots of other issues that came up, I dare say. Anything else worth mentioning, would you say?
You're right. It was actually quite a big meeting, and it went. I think I can't remember the exact time it finished actually, but it probably went for about till about 8:30 last night or thereabouts. It was a big meeting, so a lot of things in there. I suppose the other couple of little ones that worth mentioning, one is just exploring some options for the New South Wales Destination Charging Grant. So this is in relation to electric vehicle charges. The government has now said that if you want to put one in a tourist location, then you can have 75% of the funding for that. So we are now putting forward, following a resolution from Councillor Ivey last night, putting forward the option of a few different destinations in the Dubbo Regional Council area. For example, Wellington Caves is one that's put forward. But looking at those different areas, the idea is we want to attract people to come to those tourist destinations. And if there's a charger there, they may say, oh, we'll just stop here and charge up for 10 minutes. And, oh, wow, look at this great tourist attraction. I might stay here for a couple of hours and have a look around. So I think that's something that's quite good. And the other one, just not necessarily on the agenda last night, but just worth mentioning, is our community leaders breakfast tomorrow morning. That's something that doesn't happen anywhere else in the nation. You'll have myself and fellow councillors there. You'll have the state member Dougal Saunders, the federal member Mark Colton, all three levels of government side by side from 7:30 to 9:30 tomorrow morning at the Rotunda. A bit of breakfast on offer. There'll be a barbecue breakfast there. So something like that. Again, we've looked across the nation. We can't find anywhere else that on a regular basis those three levels of government stand side by side. So if you like what happened at the council meeting last night, or you think it's terrible what happened at the council meeting last night, or you want to talk about anything else in particular or in general, then come along and talk to the three leaders. And there's no chance for the leaders to palm it off to the other level of government because they're standing right there beside you. So it's really a good open forum.
Fantastic. I think that is a fantastic idea. Now, I believe there is another meeting being held on Monday. Do you know anything about that, and what is that one about?
Yeah, so that one is specifically in relation to the budget for next financial year. And we had to wait. We couldn't actually do it at the meeting last night because we had to wait for final approval from IPART in relation to a request to change the rate pegging amount from 0.7% increase to 2.3% increase. We only just received notification that they'd approved that just a couple of days ago, 3 days ago, so we couldn't get that into the meeting agenda for last night. So Monday's meeting, which will be a lunchtime meeting, is specifically one item on the agenda, and that will be the budget for next year. We've received lots of submissions around a whole range of issues, as you can imagine. One of the major issues, obviously, is that rate rise. So we could leave the rates as they are now. We could put it up by 0.7, which was the original rate pegging amount. We could put it up by 2.3. If we go from the 0.7 to the 2.3, that will generate about an extra $642,000. And we've earmarked that amount, if we go forward with that, just to put into roads. Now, going from no rate rise to the 2.3% for the average ratepayer in Dubbo will mean a difference of about $26 a week, or 50 cents not $26 a week. Let me go back very quickly on that. $26 a year, or 50 cents a week, to give people some idea of the difference there. And so that's, again, a decision that will be made, and a whole range of other issues. People put forward the family pass for the pool, for example. There were submissions on that in terms of how much that might go up by. So any of those things that relate to the budget for next year, that decision and any changes to that will be made on Monday at that particular meeting.
Well, that sounds very interesting. I think I'm going to have to follow up with that on Monday. Thank you. Thank you so much for chatting to me.
Thanks, Sam.